More than 300 million years ago, long before cities, languages, or even the first dinosaurs, the Earth wore a very different face. Across the equatorial regions of the planet stretched a world that would feel strange to modern eyes. Instead of open plains or familiar forests of oak and pine, the land was covered by endless wetlands, where ancient forests rose from dark water and mist. These forests were unlike anything alive today. Towering lycopod trees lifted narrow trunks 30 meters into the humid air, their crowns spreading like green fireworks above the swamps. Giant horseales grew in dense stands along the water's edge, while enormous ferns unfolded leaves as long as small boats. In the heavy air, the scent of damp soil and vegetation never faded. Warmth wrapped the planet's equatorial belt, and rainfall arrived again and again, feeding swamps that seemed to have no end. The ground beneath these forests rarely dried. Water pooled between roots, forming quiet channels where amphibians moved slowly through the shadows. Above the wetlands, the air itself felt different. Oxygen levels were far higher than in the modern world, and life responded in remarkable ways. Dragonflies with wingspans wider than hawks glided through shafts of light. Insects crawled across bark and leaf litter, some growing larger than any insect alive today. For millions of years, this green world expanded across continents. Layer upon layer of fallen plants settled into the wet soil, where decay slowed almost to silence. Those quiet layers would one day become coal, carrying the memory of ancient sunlight into a distant future. To the creatures living there, the forests must have felt endless. Generation after generation moved through the same warm wetlands without ever witnessing a world beyond the trees. Nothing in their daily struggle suggested that this empire of green could ever disappear. Yet the planet was quietly shifting. Continents drifted. Mountains slowly rose. Winds changed their paths across the globe. Rain would not fall forever in the same places, and hidden within the thriving forests was a delicate balance that almost no creature could sense. The wetlands depended on endless moisture, steady warmth, and rivers that wandered slowly through low land. If even one of those conditions changed, the forest would begin to transform. But such changes unfold slowly in the language of deep time. A season grows slightly drier, a river shifts its course, a stretch of swamp becomes firm ground. At first, the forest simply adjusts. Leaves still unfold, insects still hum, amphibians still glide through quiet pools. But over centuries and then millennia, the balance begins to tilt, spaces open in the endless green. Sunlight touches ground that once lived in shadow, and somewhere in the quiet breathing of the forest, the first hints of change begin to gather. The creatures of that ancient world could not see it, yet the conditions that allowed the forest to rule the earth were already preparing a future in which they would slowly fade away forever. The ancient forests did more than cover the land. They quietly began reshaping the very air above the planet. To anyone standing within those swamps, the world would have seemed calm and ordinary. Leaves opened toward the light. Ferns unfurled slowly in the humid warmth. Rain fell, rivers moved, insects hummed in the heavy atmosphere. Yet hidden inside these ordinary processes was a transformation that would alter the entire chemistry of the earth. Every day, across millions of square kilometers of wetlands, plants absorbed carbon dioxide from the air. Sunlight fueled a silent exchange. Carbon became wood, roots, and leaves. Oxygen drifted back into the sky. At first the change was invisible, a fraction of a percent, then another. Over thousands of years the forests continued breathing, and the atmosphere slowly began to shift. Oxygen levels rose higher than anything the modern world has known. Scientists believe the air may have contained as much as 30 to 35% oxygen, far above the 21% people. That difference may sound small, but for life it changed everything. Insects, which breathe through tiny tubes that carry air directly into their bodies, suddenly found themselves living in an environment where oxygen flowed more easily through their tissues. In this rich atmosphere, their bodies could grow larger without suffocating, and so they did. Dragonflies appeared with wings stretching wider than a hawk's. They glided through the warm air above the swamps, silent hunters drifting between the crowns of ancient trees. On the forest floor, enormous millipedes crawled through the leaf litter, their segmented bodies moving like slow armored trains across the damp ground. The forests were not merely supporting life, they were rewriting the rules of how large life could become. But an even deeper change was unfolding beneath the waterlogged soil. When plants died in those ancient wetlands, their remains did not fully decay. The swamps were thick with water and poor in oxygen. Instead of returning quickly to the atmosphere, fallen leaves and trunks settled into the mud where time slowed their breakdown. Layer after layer of plant material gathered in quiet darkness. Carbon that had once floated freely in the air became locked underground. Year after year, century after century, the forests continued this silent burial. With every layer of organic matter sealed beneath the swamps, the atmosphere changed a little more. Carbon dioxide declined. Oxygen continued to rise, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the climate of the planet began to shift. It is a strange thought. The forests that filled the earth with life were also transforming the world in ways no creature could foresee. To the amphibians gliding through warm water, the forests seemed eternal. To the insects riding gentle currents above the canopy, the air felt perfectly suited to flight. Yet with every season of growth, every fallen trunk, every buried leaf, the forests were quietly altering the balance of the planet itself. They were breathing life into the world, and with each breath they were pushing the earth toward a future that would not belong to them forever. For millions of years, the forests endured. Across the equatorial regions of the ancient supercontinent, wetlands stretched so far that no creature living within them could ever hope to reach their edges. Swamp forests covered enormous landscapes, forming a nearly unbroken belt of green that followed the warm middle of the earth. The climate rarely changed. Rain arrived often, sometimes gently drifting through the canopy, sometimes falling in steady tropical storms that fed rivers and flooded the lowlands. Water gathered between roots and drifted slowly through channels carved into the dark soil. Sunlight filtered through towering plants whose forms would seem strange today. The tall trunks of lycopod trees rose like pillars from the wetlands. Giant horseales crowded the water's edge. Ferns layered the forest floor with endless leaves. Everything in this world had adapted to the rhythm of warmth and water. Amphibians thrived in these swamps. Some grew long and slender, gliding through shallow pools. Others developed broader bodies suited for crawling through dense vegetation. Their lives remained tied to water, where their eggs could develop safely and their skin could stay moist beneath the humid air. Nearby, early reptiles began appearing in quiet numbers. They were small, cautious creatures at first, exploring the edges of the wetlands where the ground occasionally dried. Their presence hinted at new possibilities for life on land, though few could yet imagine how important they would become. For countless generations, the forests remained stable. Creatures were born beneath the same towering plants their ancestors had known. They hunted among the same shadows, drank from the same rivers, and died within the same endless wetlands. Nothing in their world suggested that the forests might someday vanish. When an environment remains stable for such immense spans of time, life adapts completely to its conditions. Every plant, every animal, every hidden insect becomes finely tuned to the same pattern of rain, warmth, and soil. The result is a powerful illusion. The ecosystem begins to feel permanent. To the amphibians gliding through quiet water, the forests must have seemed as eternal as the sky itself. Even the insects drifting through the humid air would have known nothing beyond the endless green world surrounding them. But deep beneath the surface of the earth, forces were slowly gathering. Continents continued their patient movement across the planet. Mountains rose where land collided. Oceans shifted, and with them the currents of wind and rain that shaped climates around the globe. These changes unfolded far too slowly for any living creature to notice. 1,000 years passed like a single season in the language of geology, yet the stability of the ancient forests depended on something fragile, something easy to overlook because it had always been there. Rain. The endless wetlands survived only because moisture returned again and again to the same landscapes. If those patterns shifted, even slightly, the forests would begin to change. For now, the swamps still breathed with life. The rivers still wandered through the wetlands. The air remained thick with warmth and oxygen. But the planet was already beginning to move toward a different future, and when the rhythm of rain began to change, The world that once felt permanent would slowly start to disappear. For a long time, nothing seemed different. The forests still stretched across the equator in endless waves of green. Rain continued to fall, feeding rivers that wandered through the wetlands. Amphibians moved through quiet pools, and insects drifted above the canopy in warm currents of air. To every creature living there, the world appeared unchanged. Yet far beyond the swamps, the surface of the earth was slowly rearranging itself. During the late Carboniferous period, continents were drifting toward one another in a slow geological dance that would eventually create the massive supercontinent known as Pangaea. Land that had once been separated by oceans began pressing together. Where those land masses collided, enormous mountain ranges slowly rose toward the sky. This movement was silent and gradual. A human lifetime would have been far too short to notice such changes. Even thousands of years might pass without any obvious transformation. But mountains have a powerful influence over the atmosphere. As these new ranges lifted higher, they began altering the movement of winds across the planet. Moist air that once traveled freely across continents now encountered barriers of stone. Rain fell in different places, storms followed new paths, over immense stretches of time. These subtle changes began reshaping the climate of the equatorial forests. At first, the differences were almost impossible to see. A swamp that had always remained flooded might dry for a short period during a warm season. A river that once flowed steadily could change course as sediments shifted beneath its banks. Areas of wet ground occasionally hardened under the sun before the rains returned again. To the creatures living within the forest, the trees still stood tall, the swamps still held water. Life continued moving through the dense vegetation as it always had. But ecosystems built upon constant moisture are surprisingly fragile. The ancient forests depended on saturated soils and predictable rainfall. Even small interruptions in that balance could ripple outward through the environment. Plants adapted to permanent wetlands struggled when their roots touched drier ground. Soil chemistry began to shift. Open spaces appeared where dense vegetation once grew. These early changes did not destroy the forests. Instead, they created subtle disturbances, small gaps in the vast green landscape. Modern scientists first noticed these clues while studying ancient rock layers. In many places around the world, thick seams of coal mark the presence of the ancient swamps where plant material accumulated for millions of years. But between some of those layers, researchers found something unexpected: sediments that formed in drier environments. These interruptions in the record suggested that the great wetlands had begun to shrink at certain times, replaced temporarily by landscapes far less saturated with water. It was a quiet signal buried deep in stone, a hint that the forests were no longer as stable as they once seemed. At the time, the swamps still ruled the planet. Their trees still towered above the wetlands, and life continued moving through their shadows. Yet the planet had begun changing in ways that would slowly reshape those ecosystems. The first signs were subtle: a little less rain, a little more sunlight reaching the ground. Small shifts that, over thousands of years, would begin unraveling the greatest forests the Earth had ever known. And with those first quiet changes, the mystery of the forest world's collapse had already begun. At first, the forests did not fall, they began to loosen. Around 305 million years ago, the rhythms of rain across the equatorial world slowly began to change. Storms that once arrived with dependable regularity became less predictable. Seasons that had always remained wet now carried intervals of unfamiliar dryness. To the creatures living within the swamps, the shift would have felt subtle at first. A shallow pool that once lasted through the year might shrink beneath the sun before the rains returned. A stretch of marshland could harden slightly underfoot, only to soften again when storms drifted across the canopy. But the ancient forests depended on constant water. The towering lycopod trees that dominated these wetlands had shallow roots designed for soft, saturated ground. Their trunks rose high above the swamps, but beneath the surface their grip on the earth remained delicate. When the soil dried, even briefly, those roots struggled to draw the moisture they needed. At first, only small areas changed. A cluster of trees might weaken where the ground no longer stayed flooded. Leaves thinned, growth slowed. Eventually a few trunks toppled into the shallow water, leaving openings in the canopy where sunlight poured down onto the forest floor. Light that once filtered softly through layers of leaves now reached the soil directly. And sunlight carries heat. Where the canopy opened, the ground dried more quickly. Ferns that thrived in shadow began to wither. Moist soil hardened into cracked surfaces between exposed roots. The small clearing slowly widened as neighbouring plants faced the same unfamiliar conditions. The forest had begun to unravel. Yet the change did not sweep across the landscape all at once. In some regions, the wetlands remained lush and green, fed by rivers that still wandered through low ground. Amphibians continued to glide through quiet pools. Giant insects still drifted above the canopy in warm air rich with oxygen. Elsewhere, however, the pattern was shifting. From a distance, the once endless rainforest belt was slowly fragmenting. Great stretches of swamp still survived, but between them appeared growing patches of drier terrain. What had once been a continuous ecosystem was quietly separating into pieces. This uneven transformation made the change harder to recognize. One valley still held water. Another, only a short distance away, began experiencing long intervals without rain. Creatures migrating through the forest might encounter thriving wetlands one day and struggling vegetation the next. The ancient world had entered a period of transition. Each drying swamp weakened the stability of the ecosystem around it. Openings in the canopy allowed heat to reach the ground. Drier soil made it harder for new plants to grow. Small clearings widened, then connected with others. Like a line of falling dominoes, each disturbance created the conditions for the next. To the creatures living within the forest, the change would have unfolded slowly enough to feel almost natural. A little less water here, a little more sunlight there, but over thousands of years the pattern became unmistakable. The endless wetlands that once ruled the equatorial world were beginning to break apart, and as the forests fragmented into scattered patches of green, every plant and animal within them faced a new and unfamiliar challenge. For the first time in millions of years, the forest was no longer endless. As the forest began to break apart, the creatures living within them faced a world that no longer behaved the way it once had. For millions of years, the ancient wetlands had offered stability. Water remained everywhere. The air stayed warm and heavy. Plants and animals evolved slowly within an environment that rarely demanded dramatic change. But now the rhythm of the landscape was shifting. Pools that once remained full through every season sometimes dried beneath the sun. Channels of water that amphibians relied upon grew shallow or disappeared altogether. The thick carpet of damp soil that had supported entire ecosystems began hardening in scattered places. For amphibians, this new world was deeply troubling. Their bodies were built for moisture. Their skin, thin and permeable, allowed them to breathe and absorb water directly from the environment. But that same skin made them vulnerable when conditions became dry. Even brief exposure to arid ground could threaten their survival. In the shrinking wetlands, amphibians still thrived. They hunted insects along muddy banks and slipped quietly through the remaining pools. Yet beyond those fading swamps, the land was becoming increasingly difficult for them to inhabit. Meanwhile, another group of animals was beginning to move through the changing landscape with far greater ease. Early reptiles had already appeared during the later Carboniferous period. At first, they were small and easily overlooked among the dense vegetation of the forests. But their bodies carried a remarkable advantage. Their skin formed a protective barrier that slowed the loss of water. More importantly, their eggs were enclosed within protective membranes and shells, allowing their young to develop safely on land instead of requiring open water. This difference may seem simple, but in the shifting world of the drying swamps, it changed everything. While amphibians remained tied to shrinking wetlands, reptiles could explore the newly forming spaces between forests. They ventured across patches of firm ground where sunlight reached the soil. They moved through drier woodlands and along riverbanks that no longer flooded constantly. What had once been a limitation for amphibians became an opportunity for reptiles. Slowly, almost quietly, reptiles began occupying environments that amphibians could no longer dominate. Small predators hunted insects in areas where the wetlands had receded. Others explored new sources of food among emerging plant communities. The plants themselves were changing as well. Many of the towering swamp species struggled to survive in soils that no longer remained permanently saturated. In some regions they disappeared entirely, replaced by plants capable of enduring longer periods without water. The once uniform rainforest world was transforming into a more varied landscape of wetlands, seasonal forests, and drier terrain. With every environmental shift, evolution began adjusting the balance of life. Traits that had once been minor details suddenly became powerful advantages. Creatures that could tolerate dryness gained new territory. Those dependent on constant water found their world shrinking. To the animals living through this transition, the change may have felt gradual and uncertain, but in the larger story of life on Earth, something profound had begun. The collapse of the ancient forests was not simply destroying ecosystems. It was quietly reshaping the future of life on land. And as these changes continued spreading across the continent, the fragmented forests were moving toward a moment that would alter the planet's ecosystems forever. For tens of millions of years, the ancient forests had stretched across the equator like a living continent. Wetlands flowed into more wetlands, and towering plants formed a nearly unbroken canopy across vast distances. To the creatures living beneath those trees, the forest must have felt as permanent as the land itself. But permanence on Earth is often an illusion. Around 305 million years ago, the slow changes that had been quietly building across the planet reached a turning point. The delicate balance of water, soil, and climate that sustained the ancient rainforest world began to fail. Scientists today call this moment the Carboniferous rainforest collapse. At first, the transformation did not look like a single catastrophic event. There was no sudden firestorm or violent disaster sweeping across the forests. Instead, the change unfolded gradually, but on a scale so vast that it reshaped entire continents. The once endless belt of rainforest began breaking apart. Where thick wetlands had once dominated the landscape, new environments appeared. Patches of dry ground spread between forests that had once connected seamlessly. Seasonal woodlands replaced permanent swamps. In some places, open terrain stretched beneath skies that had rarely been visible before. The great forest empire did not simply shrink, it fractured. Across equatorial regions, ecosystems that had remained stable for millions of years became scattered into isolated fragments. One valley might still hold dense vegetation and deep swamps, while another only a short distance away transformed into drier land, where the ancient plants could no longer thrive. For the creatures tied closely to the wetlands, the consequences were severe. Many amphibians had evolved in a world where water surrounded them at every moment. Their eggs required moisture. Their skin demanded humidity. When swamps disappeared and streams shrank, entire populations suddenly faced conditions they could not endure. Species that had flourished for ages quietly vanished from the fossil record. The loss of these animals marked one of the earliest large-scale ecosystem disruptions known from life on land. Environments that once supported rich communities of amphibians and swamp plants now stood empty or transformed. Yet, even as some forms of life disappeared, others were beginning to expand. Reptiles already better suited to drier landscapes moved into territories where amphibians once dominated. Their protective eggs allowed them to reproduce away from water. Their skin slowed the loss of moisture beneath the sun. Plants also began changing. The towering swamp species that had ruled the wetlands declined in many areas, replaced by vegetation capable of surviving seasonal dryness. Seed plants, in particular, began spreading across landscapes where spores alone could no longer ensure survival. The collapse of the rainforests was therefore not only an ending, it was also a beginning. Extinction and innovation unfolded side by side as the ancient ecosystems dissolved. Life did not stop adapting simply because the world was changing. Instead, new possibilities emerged from the ruins of the old forests. The greatest rainforest Earth had ever known had shattered into fragments, and in its place a different kind of world was beginning to take shape, one that would guide the future of life on land in directions no creature of the swamps could have imagined. Yet one mystery remained. What had pushed the planet to change so dramatically in the first place? By the time the great rainforests began breaking apart, the planet itself had already entered a period of profound transition. The forests had once thrived in a world where climate patterns remained steady for millions of years. Warm air carried moisture across equatorial lands, feeding endless wetlands where ancient plants grew without interruption. Rain arrived again and again, nourishing swamps that seemed impossible to exhaust. But the Earth is never truly still. Far beneath the forests, enormous slabs of the planet's crust were moving slowly across the surface. Continents that had once drifted apart were gradually colliding, assembling the immense supercontinent that would eventually be known as Pangaea. Where these landmasses pressed together, mountains rose from the ground. To the creatures living in the swamps, those distant mountain ranges would have meant nothing. They lay far beyond the wetlands, invisible to amphibians gliding through shallow pools or insects drifting above the canopy. Yet mountains have a quiet influence over the sky. As these ranges grew taller, they began altering the movement of winds across the planet. Moist air that once travelled freely across low continents now encountered barriers of stone. Clouds released their rain earlier than before, leaving regions farther inland drier than they had been for millions of years. The pattern of rainfall began to change. Meanwhile, another transformation was unfolding high above the forests. For ages, the immense vegetation of the Carboniferous wetlands had been drawing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Each generation of plants captured carbon through photosynthesis, and when those plants died, much of that carbon became buried in the waterlogged soils. Over immense stretches of time, this quiet burial gradually lowered the amount of carbon dioxide in the air. And carbon dioxide plays an important role in holding warmth within the planet's atmosphere. As its levels declined, the Earth slowly began to cool. Evidence preserved in ancient rocks suggests that during this same period, glaciers were expanding across parts of the southern hemisphere. Vast ice sheets formed on land masses that now lie scattered across modern continents. These glaciers further altered global climate systems. As they advanced and retreated, they influenced ocean circulation and atmospheric currents, sending ripples through the planet's delicate climate balance. Rainfall patterns shifted again. In the equatorial regions where the ancient forests once flourished, the climate gradually became more seasonal. Wet periods still arrived, but they were interrupted by longer intervals of dryness. Swamps that had remained permanently flooded for millions of years began experiencing cycles of flooding and retreat. What had once been a stable world was becoming unpredictable. No single force alone destroyed the forests. Instead, the collapse appears to have been the result of several planetary processes unfolding at the same time. Continental movement altered winds. Mountains redirected rainfall. Falling carbon dioxide cooled the atmosphere. Expanding ice reshaped climate patterns. Each change reinforced the others. Together, they pushed the ancient rainforest ecosystem beyond the conditions it needed to survive. There is a strange irony hidden within this story. The forests that had transformed the atmosphere through millions of years of growth may have helped create the climate shifts that ended their own reign. A world built by forests had slowly become a world where those forests could no longer thrive. And as the ancient swamps faded into scattered remnants of their former glory, the planet prepared for a new chapter in the long history of life on land. By the time the Great Rainforest collapse had run its course, the ancient green world no longer stretched unbroken across the equator. What had once been an endless belt of swamp forest now existed only in scattered pieces. From above, the transformation would have been unmistakable. Instead of a continuous sea of vegetation, the landscape had become a patchwork of wetlands, dry terrain, and struggling forests separated by unfamiliar gaps of open land. The swamps had not disappeared entirely, but they had been divided. Large wetland ecosystems that once flowed seamlessly into one another had fractured into isolated pockets surrounded by drier ground. Rivers that once connected vast marshlands now ended in shrinking basins. Areas that had remained permanently flooded for millions of years had hardened beneath the sun. The forests had become islands. Within each surviving patch, life continued much as it always had. Amphibians still slipped through the water. Ferns still opened their fronds toward the light. Giant insects still moved through the humid air beneath the canopy. But the world beyond those pockets had changed. Creatures that once migrated freely across endless wetlands now found their territories suddenly limited. A swamp that had once connected to countless others might now stand alone, surrounded by dry ground that amphibians could not easily cross. Populations that had once mixed across vast regions were now trapped in shrinking habitats. At first, the change may not have felt like disaster. One valley still held lush vegetation and deep pools of water. Only a short distance away, however, another valley had begun drying into seasonal land where swamp plants struggled to survive. For the animals living inside the remaining forests, the transformation would have been confusing rather than dramatic. Life continued in familiar ways within the wet patches that remained. Yet the borders of those habitats were quietly retreating. The illusion of stability lingered even as the ecosystem slowly unraveled. Fossil evidence preserved in rock layers tells the deeper story. In places where ancient coal beds record the presence of thick rainforest vegetation, scientists have discovered sudden interruptions. Sediments formed in environments that were far drier. These layers reveal a repeating pattern: wetland forest, then dry ground, then forest again. But each return of the wetlands covered less territory than before. Over time, the shrinking swamps could no longer support the same diversity of life that once flourished within them. Plant communities that had dominated the Carboniferous landscape for tens of millions of years disappeared from entire regions of the supercontinent. Amphibians that depended on permanent moisture faced an increasingly uncertain world. Scientists today describe this moment as an ecological tipping point. Once the fragmentation began. The rainforest ecosystem could no longer stabilize itself. Each shrinking swamp weakened the larger system that had once supported it. Every isolated patch became more vulnerable to drought, fire, and environmental change. Small disturbances that once would have healed naturally now pushed ecosystems closer to collapse. The once mighty rainforest empire had not vanished in a single moment. It had broken apart piece by piece, and in the spaces between those fading forests, life now faced a new and unfamiliar challenge: learning how to survive in isolation. As the forests fragmented, the remaining swamps became something they had never been before. Islands, not islands surrounded by ocean, but islands of life surrounded by unfamiliar land. Each surviving forest patch stood apart from the others, separated by stretches of ground that had grown too dry for the ancient wetlands to reclaim. Within those scattered pockets, life continued. The towering plants still formed thick canopies above the swamps. Pools of dark water remained beneath tangled roots. Amphibians moved quietly through the same wetlands their ancestors had known for ages. Yet something fundamental had changed. In the past, animals and plants could spread easily across the endless forests. A population living in one region might slowly expand into another, mixing with neighboring groups across the vast wetland belt. Now those pathways were broken. Creatures living within one patch of forest rarely encountered those living in another. The land between them had become too harsh, too dry, too unfamiliar. Isolation had arrived. Over time, this separation began shaping the course of evolution in surprising ways. Within each forest island, populations adapted to the exact conditions surrounding them. Amphibians in one swamp might develop slightly different features from those in another. Subtle variations in body shape, size, or behavior appeared as generations passed. Fossil discoveries from this period reveal a burst of diversity among certain groups of amphibians. Species that once shared similar forms began diverging into new varieties, each suited to the environment of its isolated refuge. In the short term, fragmentation created something that looked almost like innovation. Life was experimenting. But isolation carries a hidden danger. Large ecosystems offer stability. When populations remain connected, they share genetic diversity and resources across wide regions. If conditions worsen in one place, species can migrate to another. Isolated ecosystems have no such protection. Each forest island supported only a limited number of individuals. If drought struck one swamp, the creatures living there could not easily escape to another wetland. If a river changed course or a fire swept through the vegetation, entire populations might vanish in a single event. Plants face similar struggles. The towering lycopod trees that had once dominated vast wetlands found it difficult to survive beyond permanently flooded ground. Their shallow root systems were perfectly suited for swamps, but poorly adapted to soils that occasionally dried. As conditions changed, these ancient giants disappeared from many regions. In their place, other plants slowly began appearing, species capable of surviving the increasingly seasonal climate. What seemed at first like an increase in diversity carried a deeper instability. The rainforest ecosystem was no longer a unified living system. It had become a fragile network of scattered habitats, each vulnerable to the pressures of a changing world. Fragmentation had opened new paths for evolution, but it had also made extinction easier. The ancient forests were not only shrinking, they were becoming unpredictable. And while amphibians struggled within these isolated pockets of life, another group of creatures was quietly beginning to thrive in the new landscapes forming between the forests. As the swamps shrank and the forests fractured into scattered islands, the balance of life on land began to shift in quiet but profound ways. For ages, amphibians had ruled the wetlands. Their bodies were perfectly suited to the humid world of the Carboniferous forests. Soft skin allowed them to absorb water directly from the environment. Their eggs developed safely in shallow pools beneath the canopy, but the ancient forests were no longer the endless wetlands they once had been. The new landscapes forming between the surviving swamps were drier and less predictable. Soil hardened beneath the sun. Pools of water appeared and vanished with changing seasons. Rivers wandered across land that no longer remained permanently flooded. For amphibians, these new conditions created limits they could not easily overcome. Their skin required constant moisture. Their eggs depended on water. Without the endless wetlands, their ability to spread across the landscape became increasingly restricted. Yet another group of animals carried an advantage that would soon reshape the future of life on land: reptiles. Early reptiles were not yet the powerful creatures that would dominate later eras. Most were small, cautious animals moving through the edges of forests and along the banks of rivers. At first glance, they might have seemed insignificant beside the amphibians that still filled the wetlands, but their bodies carried a remarkable set of tools for survival in a changing world. Unlike amphibians, reptiles possessed skin that slowed the loss of water. This protective covering allowed them to move through environments where moisture was less reliable. Even more important was the structure of their eggs. Reptilian eggs contained membranes and protective shells that shielded the developing embryo from drying out. Instead of requiring open water for reproduction, reptiles could lay their eggs on land, hidden beneath soil or vegetation. This simple innovation unlocked enormous possibilities. Where amphibians remained tied to shrinking wetlands, reptiles began exploring the growing spaces between them. They ventured across dry ground where amphibians could not travel far. They hunted insects in open clearings and along riverbanks that no longer stayed permanently wet. Over time, reptiles began spreading into territories that had once been beyond their reach. As amphibian populations declined in many regions, reptiles diversified. Different species adapted to different environments. Some remained near water, while others ventured deeper into the new woodlands and open landscapes forming across the supercontinent. What had once been a minor group of animals slowly began expanding its presence across the land. This shift may have seemed gradual at the time, yet in the long history of life on Earth, it marked one of the most important turning points. A subtle environmental change, the drying of ancient forests, had quietly altered the course of evolution. Traits that once offered only small advantages now determined which species could survive and which could not. The age of the great amphibian wetlands was fading, and the rise of reptiles had begun. But animals were not the only forms of life adapting to the new conditions spreading across the planet. Plants themselves were evolving in ways that would reshape the landscapes of the future. As the ancient rainforest continued to fragment, the plants that had once ruled the wetlands began facing a challenge they had never encountered before. For millions of years, the towering trees of the Carboniferous swamps had grown in soils that never truly dried. Their roots spread through waterlogged ground where moisture was always available, and the air above remained warm and heavy. But the world beneath those trees was changing. In many regions, the soil no longer stayed permanently saturated. Periods of dryness arrived between storms. Rivers shifted their courses, leaving once flooded ground exposed beneath the sun. For the giant lycopod trees that dominated the ancient wetlands, this change proved difficult to survive. Their shallow root systems were perfectly suited for swamps, but poorly adapted to soil that occasionally hardened. As water retreated from the land, many of these ancient plants struggled to grow. In some areas they simply vanished from the landscape. The disappearance did not happen everywhere at once. In the deepest swamps the old forests still stood. Their trunks rose above dark pools, and their crowns still formed dense canopies over the wetlands. But beyond those shrinking refuges, the vegetation of the planet was beginning to transform. New kinds of plants slowly appeared across the drying ground. Among the most important were the early seed plants. Unlike the ancient swamp vegetation, which relied on microscopic spores carried through moist air or water, these plants possessed a remarkable innovation. Instead of releasing fragile spores, they produced seeds, tiny protective capsules that sheltered a developing embryo inside. A seed could survive where a spore could not. Its protective layers guarded the young plant against drying winds and unpredictable weather. Some seeds could even remain dormant for long periods, waiting patiently until conditions allowed them to grow. This simple advantage opened vast new landscapes to plant life. As wetlands shrank, seed plants began spreading across terrain that had once been inhospitable to the ancient swamp flora. Their roots could anchor in firmer soil. Their reproductive strategies no longer required constant humidity. Gradually, the appearance of the land itself began to change. Where dense swamps once dominated the equatorial world, mixed forests and seasonal vegetation emerged. Early conifers and seed ferns spread through the transforming landscapes, forming ecosystems very different from the ancient wetlands that had preceded them. The world was becoming more varied. Wetlands still existed, but they were no longer the defining feature of the entire equatorial belt. Instead, forests appeared alongside open ground, river valleys, and drier woodlands. To the creatures living through this transformation, the changes may have seemed subtle at first. A new plant species appearing along a riverbank, a stretch of forest replaced by unfamiliar vegetation, a once shaded clearing gradually filling with plants that tolerated stronger sunlight. But over thousands of years, these small shifts accumulated into something much larger. The collapse of the ancient rainforests was not simply destroying ecosystems. It was creating new ones. Life was adapting to a changing world, experimenting with new forms and new strategies for survival. Yet the forces reshaping the forests did not stop with vegetation. Far beyond the swamps and forests, the planet itself was continuing to change. And to understand why the transformation of the ancient world accelerated so dramatically, we must look beyond the forests, to the strange climate shifts that were beginning to reshape the Earth itself. When most people imagine the age of the ancient rainforests, they picture a world entirely warm and wet. Endless swamps, humid air, and giant plants stretching across the equator. It feels like a planet locked in permanent summer, but the deeper story of the Carboniferous world holds a surprising contradiction. While enormous forests flourished beneath tropical skies, another transformation was unfolding far from the swamps. At the southern edges of the supercontinent, a very different landscape was slowly emerging. Ice geological evidence preserved in ancient rocks reveals that during this same period, vast glaciers spread across large portions of the southern hemisphere. Regions that are today part of South America, Africa, Antarctica, and Australia once lay joined together in the southern reaches of Pangaea, forming a massive landmass close to the planet's pole. There, temperatures fell low enough for enormous sheets of ice to accumulate. For a long time, this discovery puzzled scientists. How could a world known for its warm swamps and lush vegetation also contain expanding glaciers? The answer lies in the delicate balance of Earth's climate. As the Carboniferous forests spread across the equator, they quietly removed enormous quantities of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Through millions of years of growth, plants captured carbon and buried it within the waterlogged soils of the swamps. This process slowly reduced the amount of greenhouse gases in the air, and as carbon dioxide declined, the planet gradually cooled. The cooling did not affect every region equally. Near the equator, the climate remained warm enough to support the ancient wetlands. But toward the poles, temperatures fell just enough for ice sheets to begin forming across the southern supercontinent. Over immense spans of time, glaciers slowly advanced and retreated across those distant lands. These glaciers may have seemed far removed from the lush forests of the tropics, yet their influence reached across the entire planet. Ice has weight. It locks enormous quantities of water onto land. When glaciers expand, sea levels fall as water becomes trapped within ice sheets. When they retreat, that water returns to the oceans. During the late Carboniferous, these cycles of glacial growth and melting caused sea levels to rise and fall repeatedly. Coastlines shifted. Rivers altered their paths. Wetlands expanded during warmer intervals and shrank again as cooler periods returned. For the tropical forests already struggling with changing rainfall, these fluctuations added yet another layer of instability. Swamps that once remained stable for ages now experienced cycles of flooding and retreat. Some wetlands briefly expanded before drying once more. The balance that had supported the ancient rainforest empire grew increasingly fragile. There is a strange irony hidden within this story. The forests that filled the atmosphere with oxygen and drew carbon dioxide from the air were helping reshape the climate of the entire planet. In doing so, they may have played a role in creating the cooling conditions that allowed glaciers to grow at the edges of the world. A warm world of swamps was quietly drifting toward an ice age. And as the ice advanced and retreated far to the south, the climate of the planet began moving to a new rhythm, one that would reshape ecosystems across the ancient Earth. When scientists began examining the rock layers left behind by the Carboniferous world, they noticed something unusual. The ancient climate had not simply shifted once. It had pulsed again and again, like a slow heartbeat echoing through deep time. Evidence preserved in sediment and fossilized soils revealed repeating patterns of change. Layers formed in lush wetlands were followed by sediments created in drier environments, only to be replaced once more by signs of returning swamps. The forests expanded, retreated, and expanded again. These cycles were shaped by powerful forces operating far beyond the forests themselves. As glaciers slowly spread across the southern continents, enormous volumes of water became locked inside ice. Sea levels gradually fell, exposing new land along ancient coastlines. When the climate warmed and glaciers retreated, that trapped water returned to the oceans. Sea levels rose again, flooding river valleys and lowlands across the tropics. Wetlands expanded once more. But the cycles did not stop. Over thousands of years, the planet continued shifting between cooler and warmer phases. Each change altered rainfall, river flow, and the delicate balance that sustained the ancient forests. During wetter intervals, swamps briefly returned to regions that had begun to dry. Ferns spread again, and amphibians reclaimed shallow pools. Yet when the climate shifted back toward drier conditions, those fragile recoveries collapsed. Wetlands shrank, forest canopies opened, soil hardened beneath the sun. The ancient rainforest ecosystem had once depended on stability. Now it faced constant disturbance. Each climatic pulse prevented the forests from fully rebuilding their former reach. Over immense spans of time, these repeating shifts reshaped entire landscapes. Some regions transformed into seasonal forests. Others drifted toward open terrain where wetlands could no longer survive. To the creatures living through these changes, the world must have felt uncertain. Water appeared and disappeared. Forest paths shifted. Familiar habitats faded. The climate had developed a rhythm, slow but relentless. With every pulse, ecosystems adjusted, fractured, and struggled to adapt. And beyond the forests, another force was quietly shaping the future of the planet. Deep beneath the surface, the continents themselves were still moving, preparing the next transformation in the long story of Earth. The land masses that once drifted apart were slowly pressing together. Oceans narrowed, mountain chains rose, and the shape of the planet continued changing. These movements altered winds that carried moisture across continents. Storm tracks shifted, and rainfall patterns followed new paths. The forests, already weakened by repeated climate cycles, now faced another layer of uncertainty. The Earth itself was reorganizing its surface, and the living world would have to respond. In the quiet record of rocks and fossils, scientists can still trace these rhythms today. They reveal a planet never truly still, where climate, land, and life continually reshape one another across unimaginable ages. And as those ancient cycles continued turning, the stage was slowly being set for an even greater change. Driven not only by climate but by continents, shifting beneath the forests themselves far beyond their awareness entirely. While climate rhythms were already reshaping the ancient forests, an even larger transformation was unfolding beneath the surface of the planet. The continents themselves were moving. Over millions of years, the drifting land masses of Earth had slowly migrated across the globe. Oceans that once separated them narrowed as tectonic plates pushed steadily toward one another. Piece by piece, these continents began assembling into a single vast landmass that scientists would later call Pangaea. This process unfolded so slowly that no creature living on the surface could possibly have noticed it. Mountains do not rise in a single moment. Oceans do not vanish overnight. Instead, the changes occurred grain by grain, year after year, across spans of time far longer than any species could comprehend. Yet the consequences were enormous. Where continents collided, the crust of the Earth folded and lifted. Massive mountain ranges rose along the collision zones, their peaks climbing slowly into the sky. These ranges stretched across great distances, reshaping the surface of the planet and altering the pathways of wind and weather. Mountains have a quiet but powerful effect on climate. When moist air travels across the land, it rises as it encounters high terrain. As the air climbs the slopes of a mountain range, it cools and releases its moisture as rain. By the time that air descends on the other side, much of its water has already fallen. The land beyond the mountains receives far less rain. These regions are known as rain shadows. As Pangaea continued forming, new mountain ranges appeared across the growing supercontinent. The winds that once carried steady moisture across equatorial landscapes now encountered barriers of stone. Rain fell earlier along the slopes, leaving the lands beyond increasingly dry. For the ancient rainforests, this shift proved critical. The vast wetlands had developed under a very specific set of conditions: warm temperatures, constant rainfall, and low, waterlogged ground allowed the swamp vegetation to spread across enormous regions. But now the winds were changing their paths. Moisture that once reached the interior forests began falling elsewhere. Some regions that had supported dense wetlands for millions of years received gradually less precipitation. Swamps shrank and the ground between them hardened. To the creatures living among the forests, the transformation would have seemed slow and uneven. Ono Valley still received frequent rain. Another only a short distance away began experiencing longer dry seasons. Rivers that once fed wide marshes wandered across land that no longer remained permanently flooded. The forest world had not been built to endure such changes. What makes this moment so fascinating is how deeply connected the planet's systems truly are. Movements deep within the Earth's crust, far below the reach of roots or rivers, were quietly altering winds high in the sky. Those winds determined where rain would fall, and the rain determined where forests could survive. The ancient rainforests had once thrived because the climate allowed them to. Now the planet was rearranging itself in ways that gradually removed those conditions. The forests were not simply facing a changing climate. They were facing a planet that was reorganizing its entire surface. And as continents continued to merge and climates continued shifting, the once unstoppable rainforest ecosystems were drifting closer to a point from which they could no longer recover. By the time the Carboniferous rainforest collapse had run its course, the face of the planet had changed. The endless wetlands that once stretched across the equatorial world were no longer the dominant landscape. In their place appeared a patchwork of environments far more varied than the ancient swamps had ever been. Some regions still held forests, but they were different forests now. Instead of towering lycopod trees rising from dark water, new vegetation spread across firmer ground. Early conifers and seed ferns appeared where swamp plants had once ruled. Their roots anchored into soil that dried between seasons, and their seeds allowed them to survive conditions that would have destroyed the earlier forest giants. Other areas became open woodlands, where sunlight reached the ground more easily. Rivers carved paths through land that no longer remained permanently flooded. In some places, the forests gave way to landscapes that alternated between wet and dry with the passing of seasons. The world had become more unpredictable. For amphibians, this new environment was far less welcoming than the ancient swamps they once dominated. Many species declined as wetlands shrank and fragmented. Their dependence on water limited how far they could travel across the changing terrain. Yet while one group struggled, another quietly expanded. Reptiles, with their protective skin and land-adapted eggs, moved more easily through the new landscapes. They explored dry ground, wooded valleys, and riverbanks that no longer flooded constantly. Over time, they spread into environments that amphibians could not easily reach. This expansion marked the beginning of a profound evolutionary shift. The rise of reptiles was not caused by a sudden burst of innovation, but by a change in the world itself. As climates shifted and forests transformed, the conditions favored creatures capable of surviving beyond the shrinking wetlands. Plants played an equally important role in this new chapter. Seed plants spread across vast regions, forming ecosystems very different from the ancient swamp forests. Their success laid the foundation for the landscapes that would dominate the Permian period. Life was reorganizing itself. The collapse of the Carboniferous rainforests had not ended the story of life on land. Instead, it opened a doorway to new evolutionary possibilities. The ecosystems that emerged from the ruins of the ancient forests would guide the development of life for millions of years. From these changing landscapes, reptiles would eventually diversify into remarkable forms. Some would become massive herbivores roaming the early forests. Others would evolve into predators dominating the food chains of later ages, and far in the distant future, their descendants would include creatures that would rule the earth during the age of dinosaurs. What began as a slow drying of swamps had quietly reshaped the direction of evolution. The ancient rainforest empire had fallen, but life itself had adapted and moved forward. The world that replaced those forests would influence the next 200 million years of life on this planet. Yet the story leaves us with an unsettling thought. If entire ecosystems as vast and powerful as the Carboniferous rainforests could disappear, what does that reveal about the nature of our planet? The deeper history of Earth suggests that environmental transformations are not rare events. They are part of a pattern that repeats again and again across deep time. Long after the ancient rainforests vanished, their presence remained hidden beneath the surface of the Earth. Across modern continents, deep below cities, mountains and farmland, thick black layers lie buried within the rock. These layers stretch across vast regions of Europe, North America and Asia, sometimes reaching hundreds of meters in thickness. They are coal. To most people, coal is simply a fuel, a dark rock burned for heat or electricity. Yet every piece of coal carries a story far older than human civilization, a story that begins in the humid swamps of the Carboniferous world. 300 million years ago, those ancient wetlands were filled with towering plants. Giant lycopod trees rose above the swamps. Ferns spread across the forest floor. Horseales crowded the edges of quiet channels where water drifted slowly through the landscape. When these plants died, their remains did not decay in the usual way. The swamps were thick with water and low in oxygen, conditions that slowed the work of bacteria and fungi that normally break down dead vegetation. Instead of disappearing back into the air, fallen trunks and leaves accumulated in the mud. Layer upon layer of plant material settled into the wetlands. Season after season, year after year, forests grew, died, and fell into the dark soil beneath them. The process repeated endlessly across vast stretches of swamp. Over thousands of years, the buried plant matter formed thick deposits of peat. As rivers shifted and sediments accumulated above the wetlands, these peat layers were gradually buried deeper beneath the ground. Pressure increased. Heat rose slowly through the layers of sediment, and over immense spans of time, the ancient plant material began transforming. Chemical changes slowly removed water and compressed the carbon-rich remains into the dense black rock known as coal. What lies inside those coal layers is more than just fuel. It is the preserved memory of ancient forests. Scientists studying coal seams have discovered remarkable details hidden within them. Tiny fossilized spores reveal the types of plants that once filled the swamps. Fragments of bark and wood preserve the shapes of ancient trees. Fossilized roots still mark the positions where forests once stood. Through careful study of these clues, researchers have been able to reconstruct entire ecosystems that vanished hundreds of millions of years ago. Coal seams show where wetlands expanded and where they disappeared. They reveal cycles of flooding and drying, moments when forests flourished and times when they struggled. Even the chemistry of the coal tells part of the story. Each piece of coal represents sunlight captured by ancient plants long before humans existed. The energy stored within that rock began as light falling on leaves in forests that once covered the earth. The ancient rainforests may be gone, but their remains still lie beneath our feet. Every coal seam is a fossilized forest floor, compressed by time and hidden deep within the crust of the planet. Through these buried records, the lost world of the Carboniferous continues to speak, and as scientists study those silent layers, they have discovered something even more remarkable. The coal deposits do not only preserve the forests themselves, they also reveal how those forests transformed the atmosphere of the entire planet. If someone could travel back to the age of the Carboniferous forests, one of the first things they might notice would be invisible. The air itself was different. For millions of years, the vast wetlands of the ancient world had been quietly altering the atmosphere. Every leaf that opened toward the sun pulled carbon dioxide from the air. Every fallen tree buried beneath the swamps locked that carbon away in the soil, instead of returning it to the sky. Over immense spans of time, this process slowly changed the balance of gases surrounding the planet. As carbon dioxide declined, oxygen began to accumulate. Scientists studying ancient rock layers and fossilized soils have estimated that oxygen levels during the late Carboniferous may have reached 30% or more of the atmosphere. Today, the air contains about 21% oxygen. That difference may seem small, but it transforms the way life behaves. In the Carboniferous world, the atmosphere carried far more oxygen than the modern planet. This unusual chemistry shaped the living world in remarkable ways. Insects, for example, breathe through networks of tiny tubes called trachea. These tubes allow oxygen to diffuse directly into their tissues. Because their breathing system relies heavily on the surrounding atmosphere, the amount of oxygen in the air places natural limits on how large insects can grow. In the oxygen-rich Carboniferous atmosphere, those limits expanded. Dragonflies with wings stretching nearly 70 centimeters across glided above the ancient forests. Their bodies rode warm air currents between towering trees, hunting smaller insects across the swamp canopy. On the forest floor, enormous millipedes crawled slowly through the leaf litter, their armored segments stretching longer than a human arm. The world of the Carboniferous looked strangely familiar and alien at the same time. The forests were green and alive, yet the creatures moving through them seemed larger, more exaggerated, almost as if the rules of biology had been slightly altered. And in many ways they had high oxygen levels also influenced the behavior of fire. In a world where oxygen was abundant, vegetation burned more easily. Even damp forests could ignite under the right conditions. Lightning strikes could spark fires that spread rapidly through dry patches of vegetation, especially during periods when rainfall temporarily declined. These fires played a subtle role in shaping the forests themselves. Burned areas created openings in the canopy where new plants could grow. In some places, fires may have helped control the spread of certain vegetation, allowing other species to take root. The atmosphere, the forests, and the living creatures of the Carboniferous world were all part of the same interconnected system. Plants reshaped the air reshaped life, and life continued transforming the landscape. For a brief moment in Earth's history, the planet existed in a state unlike anything that came before or after, a world of towering forests breathing oxygen into the sky. But atmospheric conditions are never permanent. Just as the ancient forests had changed the chemistry of the air, new forces were already beginning to shift that balance once again, and the atmosphere that allowed giant insects to soar above the swamps would not remain that way forever. For a time, the Carboniferous world belonged to giants that could not exist today. Above the ancient forests, dragonflies with wings wider than many birds drifted through the humid air. Their delicate bodies rode warm currents between towering trees, hunting smaller insects across the swamp canopy. On the forest floor, enormous millipedes move slowly through the shadows, their armored bodies stretching longer than a human arm. To the creatures living within those wetlands, such giants were simply part of the natural world. Yet their existence depended on something fragile. The air. As long as oxygen levels remained high, the bodies of these arthropods could grow larger than anything seen in the modern world. Oxygen moved easily through their breathing systems, reaching deep into their tissues and allowing them to sustain massive forms. But the atmosphere that supported these giants would not last forever. As the Carboniferous forests declined and environmental conditions shifted across the planet, the delicate chemistry of the atmosphere began to change. Carbon dioxide levels slowly rose again as ecosystems transformed. Oxygen levels gradually declined from the extraordinary heights they had once reached. The difference may have seemed small. Yet for insects and other arthropods, even a modest change in atmospheric oxygen could reshape the limits of life. Large bodies require large amounts of oxygen. When the air carried less of it, the giant insects that once thrived above the swamps faced a growing disadvantage. Their breathing systems could no longer deliver enough oxygen to sustain such enormous forms. Generation by generation, their descendants grew smaller. Over time, the giants vanished entirely from the fossil record. The great dragonflies disappeared, replaced by smaller species more suited to the new atmosphere. The immense millipedes that once crawled through the forests faded away, leaving behind only distant relatives far reduced in size. The world had changed and life adjusted accordingly. This transformation reminds us how closely the living world depends on its environment. Creatures do not evolve in isolation. Their bodies, behaviors, and possibilities are shaped by the conditions surrounding them. In the Carboniferous age, oxygen-rich air allowed arthropods to grow to extraordinary sizes. When that atmospheric balance shifted, the giants could no longer survive. The forests had altered the chemistry of the sky, and when the forests declined, the sky changed once more. The disappearance of the giant insects marked another quiet consequence of the planet's transformation. What once seemed like a permanent feature of the ancient world proved to be only a temporary expression of environmental condition. For millions of years, enormous arthropods had ruled the skies and forest floors of the Carboniferous swamps. Then the atmosphere changed, and with that change, an entire category of life quietly vanished from the earth. Yet the disappearance of those giants was not the most important legacy of the ancient forests. What the Carboniferous world truly revealed was something deeper. It showed how delicately balanced the relationship between life and the planet can be, and how easily that balance can shift across the long history of the Earth. When the story of the Carboniferous rainforests is viewed from a distance, it begins to reveal something larger than the rise and fall of a single ecosystem. Those ancient forests once ruled the equatorial world. Their towering vegetation stretched across continents. Their swamps held enormous reservoirs of life, and their quiet growth slowly transformed the chemistry of the atmosphere itself. For tens of millions of years they appeared almost unstoppable, yet the same forces that allowed them to flourish were never fully under their control. The forests drew carbon dioxide from the air and buried it beneath the swamps. That process gradually altered the atmosphere. The changing atmosphere influenced the climate. The climate then reshaped the very ecosystems that had helped create those conditions in the first place. In this way, the forests became part of a larger planetary system. Life influenced the planet, and the planet responded. When the balance shifted, when continents moved, glaciers advanced, and rainfall patterns changed, the ancient rainforest world could no longer maintain itself. The ecosystems that once seemed permanent began to unravel. This transformation did not occur through a single dramatic disaster. There was no moment when the forests suddenly vanished. Instead, the collapse unfolded through a chain of subtle changes. Swamps dried, habitats fragmented, species adapted or disappeared. The lesson hidden within this story is both simple and profound. Even the most powerful ecosystems exist within limits set by the planet itself. The Carboniferous forests had shaped the atmosphere and dominated vast regions of the Earth, yet they remained vulnerable to deeper forces operating across geological time. Climate shifts, tectonic movements, and atmospheric chemistry all played a role in determining whether those ecosystems could survive. In the long history of the planet, similar transformations have happened many times. Coral reefs have risen and vanished as oceans changed. Ice sheets have expanded and retreated across continents. Entire groups of animals have flourished for millions of years before fading into extinction. From the perspective of human history, such changes feel unimaginable. Our sense of the world is shaped by lifetimes that last only decades. But the Earth measures time differently. Across millions of years, environments shift, continents rearrange themselves, and ecosystems transform in ways that once seemed impossible. The Carboniferous rainforest collapse stands as one of the earliest examples of this pattern. It shows how deeply connected the systems of the planet truly are, how forests influence the atmosphere, how the atmosphere shapes climate, and how climate ultimately reshapes life. The forests that once ruled the planet remind us of a simple truth. No world lasts forever, and yet the disappearance of those ancient swamps did not bring the story of life to an end. Instead, their collapse opened the door to a new chapter in Earth's history. The landscapes that replaced the forests would soon give rise to different ecosystems, new species, and entirely new evolutionary possibilities. The age of the great wetlands had passed, but the world that followed was preparing to become something even more remarkable. When the age of the Carboniferous rainforests finally faded, the Earth did not become empty. Instead, it became unfamiliar. The endless wetlands that once stretched across the equatorial world had been replaced by landscapes far more varied and unpredictable. Where dense swamps had once ruled for millions of years, a new geography slowly emerged across the growing supercontinent of Pangaea. Some regions still held forests, but they were no longer the same towering jungles of lycopod trees and giant ferns. In their place stood new plant communities shaped by the changing climate. Early seed plants spread across the land, their roots reaching into firmer soils that dried between seasons. Primitive conifers appeared as well, trees better suited to the cooler and more seasonal environments that were beginning to dominate the planet. These forests looked different from the swamps that had preceded them. Their canopies were more open. Sunlight reached the ground in wider patches. Beneath their branches grew plants that could tolerate both moisture and drought, adjusting to the unpredictable rhythm of rainfall. Beyond these forests stretched landscapes that had rarely existed during the height of the Carboniferous world. Open woodlands appeared where wetlands once stood. In some regions, broad valleys carried rivers through seasonal plains where vegetation grew and faded with the shifting climate. In other areas, the interior of the supercontinent began developing semi-arid environments where only the most resilient plants could survive. The rivers themselves had changed. During the age of the ancient swamps, waterways moved slowly through permanently saturated ground. Now many rivers followed a more dynamic rhythm. They swelled during wetter periods and shrank when the rains retreated. Channels shifted across the land, carving new paths through terrain that had once remained buried beneath marshes. To the creatures living within this evolving world, the transformation was both dangerous and full of possibility. The collapse of the rainforests had removed many of the environmental barriers that once confined life to narrow ecological niches. Vast territories that had once been dominated by swamps were now open to exploration. Where wetlands once formed natural boundaries, firm ground now allowed animals to travel farther than before. Valleys that had once been flooded year-round now offered pathways through forests and plains. New ecological spaces were appearing everywhere. For species that could adapt to the shifting climate, these landscapes offered opportunities that had never existed during the age of the swamps. Food sources changed, new habitats emerged, entire ecosystems began forming in places that had once been unreachable. Evolution rarely wastes such opportunities. The world left behind by the ancient forests was not simply a quieter version of the past. It was a new environment filled with unexplored possibilities, where plants and animals would gradually experiment with unfamiliar ways of surviving. The collapse of the old ecosystems had created space, and nature has a remarkable tendency to fill empty spaces. Across the changing landscapes of early Permian Earth, life was beginning to move into territories that had once been impossible to inhabit. The creatures best suited to dry ground and shifting climates would soon spread across these new environments. gradually reshaping the balance of life on land once again. As the landscapes of the early Permian world continued to transform, certain creatures began to thrive in ways their ancestors never could have imagined. The disappearance of the endless swamps had removed a boundary that once shaped life on land. For millions of years, the dominance of wetlands had favored animals that depended on water for nearly every stage of their lives. Amphibians flourished in that world because their bodies were built for constant moisture. But the new landscapes were different. Dry ground stretched between forests. Rivers no longer flooded every valley. Rain arrived in cycles rather than constant abundance. In this shifting environment, reptiles possessed a quiet but powerful advantage. Their skin formed a barrier that slowed the loss of moisture, allowing them to move across land where amphibians would quickly dry out. Even more important was the structure of their eggs. Unlike amphibians, whose eggs required water to survive, reptile eggs were protected by membranes and shells that preserved the developing embryo inside. With that simple adaptation, reproduction was no longer tied to ponds and wetlands. Reptiles could lay their eggs in soil, hidden beneath leaves or sand. Their young could hatch far from water, already prepared to live entirely on land. This freedom opened vast territories that amphibians could rarely explore. Across the new landscapes of Pangaea, reptiles began spreading into environments that had once been unreachable. They appeared in drier forests, where sunlight filtered through sparse canopies. They moved along riverbanks that rose and fell with the seasons. Some ventured into open terrain, where vegetation grew in scattered patches across the soil. At first these reptiles were modest creatures. Many were small and agile, resembling the lizards that would appear much later in Earth's history. Others evolved slightly different body shapes suited to particular habitats. Some hunted insects and small animals, while others fed on plants that had begun spreading through the changing landscapes. Over time, their diversity grew. As reptiles adapted to different ecological roles, they began reshaping the structure of entire food webs. Predatory reptiles emerged that hunted other small animals, while herbivorous forms grazed on new plant communities appearing across the land. This mixture of predators and plant eaters created interactions rarely seen during the swamp-dominated Carboniferous world. The transformation did not occur through sudden conquest. Instead, it unfolded quietly across generations. While amphibians remained tied to the shrinking wetlands, reptiles slowly expanded across the growing territories between forests. Each generation explored slightly farther, adapting to environments that earlier species could never have tolerated. The balance of life on land was shifting. For millions of years, the amphibians had ruled the wetlands. Their bodies had evolved perfectly for the humid forests that once covered the planet. But the planet itself had changed, and in that changing world, reptiles carried the advantages needed to succeed. The fall of the ancient rainforests had cleared a path for a new dynasty of land animals. The age of amphibians was slowly fading, and the age of reptiles had begun. Yet animals were not the only organisms adapting to the changing climate. The plants covering the land were also evolving in remarkable ways, transforming the landscapes that reptiles and other creatures would soon inhabit. As reptiles began spreading across the new landscapes of the Permian world, another transformation was quietly unfolding among the plants themselves. For millions of years, the vegetation of the Carboniferous forests had relied on a fragile method of reproduction. Most plants released microscopic spores that drifted through the humid air or washed through shallow water. These spores could only grow successfully if they landed in environments where moisture was abundant. In the endless swamps of the ancient world, that strategy worked perfectly, but the swamps were fading. Across much of the supercontinent, rainfall had become seasonal and unpredictable. Soil that once remained permanently wet now dried beneath the sun for part of the year. For spore-producing plants, these conditions created a serious challenge. Without reliable moisture, many spores could not survive long enough to grow. Yet some plants carried an innovation that would change everything. Seeds. A seed is far more than a simple reproductive cell. It is a carefully protected package containing an embryo, a supply of nutrients, and a durable outer coating designed to shield the young plant from harsh conditions. This protective structure allows the embryo to survive periods of dryness, cold, or scarcity until the environment becomes favorable again. In the shifting climates of the Permian world, this ability proved invaluable. Seeds could fall to the ground and remain dormant for months or even years, waiting patiently for the return of rain. When moisture finally arrived, the embryo inside could begin growing immediately, supported by the nutrients stored within its protective shell. This simple advantage allowed seed plants to spread across landscapes that had once been unreachable. Early conifers and seed ferns began appearing in regions where the ancient swamp plants could no longer thrive. Their roots anchored firmly in soils that dried between storms. Their seeds traveled with the wind, carried across open terrain where spores would have failed. Gradually, these plants formed new forests adapted to the rhythms of the changing climate. The landscapes of the early Permian world began filling with vegetation that looked very different from the towering lycopod swamps of the past. Mixed forests spread across hills and valleys, while scattered woodlands appeared in places that had once been covered by wetlands. The rise of seed plants did more than transform the appearance of the land. It reshaped the entire structure of life on Earth. Animals that fed on vegetation began adapting to the new plants. Herbivores evolved teeth and digestive systems suited to different types of foliage. Predators followed those herbivores, adjusting their hunting strategies as ecosystems grew more complex. With each adaptation, the web of life became richer and more varied. What began as a botanical innovation soon rippled outward through the entire biological system of the planet. The ancient rainforests had vanished, but life did not slow in their absence. If anything, the pace of evolution began accelerating. Plants experimented with new forms, animals explored new habitats. Entire ecosystems developed in places that had once been inhospitable. The disappearance of the old forests had opened space for creativity on a planetary scale, and as plants and animals continued adapting to their changing world, the Earth itself was still evolving beneath them, its shifting continents and climates preparing the stage for the next great chapter in the history of life. By the early Permian period, the continents of Earth had nearly completed a slow and monumental journey. Over hundreds of millions of years, drifting landmasses had collided and fused together, forming a single immense supercontinent known as Pangaea. From one edge of the horizon to the other, the land stretched almost without interruption, surrounded by a vast global ocean that encircled the planet. To the creatures living upon its surface, this continent must have seemed endless. Forests, plains, rivers, and mountains unfolded across distances so great that no animal could possibly experience the full scale of the land beneath its feet. Yet this enormous continent carried consequences that would shape the climate of the entire world. Large continents behave differently from smaller scattered land masses. When land is broken into many pieces separated by oceans, moisture carried by winds can easily travel across those seas and reach inland regions. Rain falls frequently, feeding forests and wetlands across wide areas. But when the continents merge into one massive body of land, something changes. The coastal regions still receive abundant rain from nearby oceans, but the deeper interior becomes increasingly distant from those sources of moisture. Winds may carry clouds across thousands of kilometers of land. Yet by the time they reach the heart of the continent, much of their water has already fallen. The interior grows dry. Across Pangaea, this pattern began shaping the landscapes of the planet. Near the coasts, forests and rivers continued to thrive. But farther inland, the climate grew harsher. Summers became hotter, winters cooler. Long intervals passed without rain. Large portions of the continent slowly drifted toward arid conditions. For the remnants of the ancient rainforests, this continental transformation proved decisive. The equatorial wetlands that once supported endless swamps had depended on constant moisture and stable temperatures. But the formation of Pangaea altered the flow of winds and rainfall across the globe. Moisture that once reached the interior forests no longer traveled so far inland. Without that steady supply of rain, the wetlands shrank. Seasonal climates replaced permanent humidity. Rivers expanded and retreated with the rhythm of storms. Landscapes that had once remained waterlogged year-round began experiencing periods of dryness that ancient swamp plants could not tolerate. The disappearance of the Carboniferous forests was not caused by a single event. It was the result of many forces working together: shifting climates, growing glaciers, evolving plant life, and the slow movement of continents beneath the Earth's crust. The assembly of Pangaea cast a long shadow across the living world. By rearranging the geography of the planet, it quietly reshaped winds, rainfall, and ecosystems across enormous distances. What had once been a stable rainforest world could no longer exist under these new conditions. The forests faded, but the planet's story did not end there. The collapse of the ancient swamps was only one chapter in a much larger transformation unfolding across the Permian Earth. New landscapes had emerged, new species were spreading across the continent, and the balance of life was shifting once again. The changes set in motion by the rainforest collapse were still unfolding. And from those shifting environments would soon arise one of the most important evolutionary eras in the history of life on land. As the Permian period unfolded, the landscapes left behind by the ancient forests became arenas for one of the most important evolutionary expansions in Earth's history. The reptiles that once crept quietly along the edges of Carboniferous wetlands were no longer confined to narrow ecological spaces. The disappearance of endless swamps and the spread of drier terrain had opened a vast new world waiting to be explored, and reptiles were ready, freed from the need to remain close to water. These animals began moving across forests, river valleys, and plains that stretched across the growing supercontinent of Pangaea. Their eggs could survive on land, their skin protected them from drying winds, and their bodies gradually adapted to environments that amphibians could rarely endure. Over time, reptiles diversified in remarkable ways. Some species developed powerful jaws and sharp teeth designed for hunting other animals. These early predators moved through the forests and open woodlands, feeding on insects, amphibians, and smaller reptiles. Their bodies became stronger and more agile as they adapted to the challenges of life on land. Other reptiles followed a different path. They evolved teeth suited for chewing vegetation, feeding on the growing variety of seed plants, and early conifers that now covered large portions of the continent. These herbivorous reptiles grew larger as they adapted to diets based on tough leaves and stems. With predators and plant eaters appearing across the landscape, the structure of ecosystems began changing dramatically. The earlier swamp worlds of the Carboniferous had been relatively simple. Amphibians dominated the wetlands, insects filled the air, and plant life remained closely tied to the conditions of constant moisture. The Permian world, however, became far more complex. Food webs expanded. Animals hunted one another across forests and plains. Herbivores grazed on new vegetation, while predators followed their movements through the changing landscapes. For the first time, reptiles began establishing themselves as the dominant vertebrates across large portions of land. Their rise did not occur through sudden conquest or violent takeover. Instead, it emerged slowly through the quiet opportunities created by environmental change. The collapse of the ancient rainforests had removed barriers that once confined reptiles to the margins of ecosystems. With wetlands shrinking and new habitats appearing across the continent, reptiles gained access to environments that had previously been unreachable. Evolution responded by experimenting with new body designs, new behaviors, and new ways of surviving. Within a relatively short span of geological time, reptiles spread across much of the land surface of the planet. This expansion carried consequences that would reach far into the future. Among the diverse reptilian groups evolving during this era were lineages that would eventually give rise to some of the most famous creatures in Earth's history. Though still small and primitive by later standards, these early reptiles carried the biological foundations for dynasties that would dominate the planet millions of years later. Full of the ancient forests had not ended the story of life. It had opened a doorway, and through that doorway stepped the ancestors of animals that would one day rule the earth. Yet even as reptiles expanded across the Permian landscapes, the world itself was far from stable. New environmental pressures were quietly building across the vast supercontinent, preparing the next chapter in the long and unpredictable story of life. By the middle of the Permian period, the world that had emerged from the collapse of the ancient rainforests had settled into a new rhythm. The swamps of the Carboniferous age were now memories buried deep within layers of coal and stone. In their place stretched landscapes that looked far more varied, and in many ways far harsher than the humid forests that once covered the equator. Across the vast supercontinent of Pangaea, seasonal climates shaped the land. Rain still arrived, but not with the endless consistency of the old wetlands. Wet seasons filled rivers and nourished vegetation, while dry intervals hardened the soil and thinned the forests. The interior of the continent became a patchwork of ecosystems. Forests still stood in many regions, but they were forests of a different kind. Seed plants now dominated the vegetation, replacing the towering swamp trees that once thrived in permanently flooded ground. Conifers rose above woodlands where sunlight reached the earth more freely, and seed ferns spread across hills and valleys shaped by the changing climate. The appearance of the land itself had evolved. Where dense wetlands once stretched across the horizon, open forests and seasonal plains now defined the landscape. Some regions supported lush vegetation during wetter periods, while others remained dry enough to limit plant growth to scattered woodlands. Animal life had changed just as dramatically. Reptiles now occupied many of the ecological roles once dominated by amphibians. Predatory reptiles stalked prey through forests and open terrain. Herbivorous species grazed on the new vegetation, spreading across the land. Their bodies grew larger and more specialized as they adapted to different diets and habitats. Some reptiles developed powerful limbs suited for traveling across firm ground. Others evolved distinctive teeth designed to slice flesh or grind tough plant material. The ecosystems of the Permian world were becoming increasingly complex. Predators hunted herbivores. Herbivores consumed the expanding plant life, and smaller animals filled the spaces between them. Food webs grew richer and more intricate than those of the earlier swamp-dominated world. Amphibians, though still present, retreated toward environments where moisture remained reliable. Lakes, rivers, and the remaining wetlands provided refuges where their bodies continued to thrive. The balance of life had shifted. What had once been an amphibian-dominated world had become one where reptiles held increasing influence over land ecosystems. Their adaptations allowed them to move freely across landscapes that would have been impossible for their ancestors. For a time, this new arrangement created something resembling stability. The Permian world had reached a fresh ecological equilibrium, shaped by evolving plants, expanding reptiles, and climates defined by seasonal variation rather than constant humidity. A completely new world had risen from the ruins of the ancient rainforests. Yet stability on Earth is rarely permanent. The forces that reshape ecosystems, climate shifts, geological movements, and biological evolution never truly stop. Even as this new world settled into place, deeper changes were already gathering beyond the horizon, and the balance that defined the Permian landscapes would one day face challenges just as powerful as those that had once brought the Carboniferous forests to an end. Although the Permian world had settled into a new balance, it was not a quiet or unchanging place. The vast supercontinent of Pangaea stretched across enormous distances, and with such scale came powerful variations in climate. Some regions received regular rain, supporting forests and river valleys filled with vegetation. Others experienced long dry seasons where the land baked beneath the sun, and only the most resilient plants could survive. Across this varied landscape, life continued adjusting to an environment that refused to remain predictable. For many species, these changes offered opportunity. Reptiles adapted quickly to the shifting climates. Some evolved bodies suited for running across dry plains, their limbs stronger and more upright than those of earlier animals. Others developed thicker skin and specialized behaviors that allowed them to survive in regions where water was scarce. Certain species flourished in environments that would have been impossible during the age of endless wetlands. At the same time, other animals remained closely tied to wetter habitats. Amphibians continued living near lakes, rivers, and marshes where moisture remained abundant. In these refuges, their bodies still functioned exactly as evolution had shaped them millions of years earlier. The Permian world had become a place of contrasts. In one valley, forests flourished beside winding rivers. In another, dry winds swept across open terrain where hardy vegetation clung to the soil. Animals adapted to each of these environments in different ways, experimenting with new forms and strategies for survival. Some reptiles developed specialized teeth for crushing hard plant material. Others evolved sharper claws and stronger jaws for capturing prey. Body shapes diversified as animals adapted to climbing, digging, or running across open landscapes. The result was a remarkable burst of evolutionary diversity. Groups of reptiles that once shared similar ancestors began diverging into distinct branches, each suited to its own ecological niche. Predators, herbivores, scavengers, and smaller opportunistic species all found places within the expanding food webs of the Permian world. Life on Earth had entered a period of experimentation. Environmental instability forced species to adapt, and each adaptation opened new possibilities while closing others. Some animals thrived as conditions changed, spreading into habitats that earlier generations could not survive. Others declined as their environments shrank or transformed beyond their limits. The history of life is filled with such moments. Every shift in climate or geography rearranges the living world. Species compete, adapt, and evolve as the environment reshapes the boundaries of survival. In the Permian period, this process unfolded across a continent that stretched nearly from pole to pole. The diversity of life expanded as ecosystems adjusted to new climates, new vegetation, and new patterns of rainfall. To the creatures living within this world, the changes must have felt like a natural part of life. But hidden within the deeper history of the planet, another transformation was slowly gathering. The Permian landscapes, rich with evolving life, were approaching a turning point that few ecosystems could survive. And when that moment arrived, the balance of life on Earth would shift once again in ways far more dramatic than the collapse of the ancient rainforests. By the late Permian period, life on Earth appeared to have reached a new height of complexity. Across the vast landscapes of Pangaea, ecosystems had grown rich and varied. Forests of seed plants spread across valleys and hillsides. Rivers carved paths through woodlands where herbivorous reptiles grazed on dense vegetation. Predators moved silently through these environments, hunting prey that had evolved alongside them for countless generations. The world felt full again. The collapse of the ancient Carboniferous rainforests had reshaped the planet, but life had adapted and flourished in the new conditions. Reptiles now dominated land ecosystems. Amphibians continued surviving in wetter regions. Plants had evolved new ways to spread and thrive across seasonal climates. To an observer living in that world, the balance of nature might have seemed stable once more. Yet the deeper history of the planet tells a different story. Hidden within the layers of rock that record the Permian era are subtle signals that something extraordinary was beginning to unfold. Fossil records show unusual changes in climate patterns. Certain species began disappearing from regions where they had long thrived. In some places, sediments reveal sudden shifts in temperature and ocean chemistry. These clues point toward a growing instability within the Earth's systems. Deep beneath the crust, enormous geological forces were stirring. Volcanic activity began increasing in parts of the world, releasing gases into the atmosphere that slowly altered the planet's climate. Changes in ocean circulation disrupted marine ecosystems, affecting the delicate balance between life in the seas and life on land. The signs were faint at first. A species vanishes here, a habitat changes there, but over time the signals became impossible to ignore. The Permian world, rich with reptiles, forests, and diverse ecosystems, was approaching a moment that would reshape the history of life more dramatically than any event that had come before. Scientists now refer to this coming catastrophe as the Permian mass extinction. Many call it the Great Dying. During this event, nearly 90% of marine species and a vast number of land animals would disappear from the Earth. Entire ecosystems would collapse, leaving the planet quieter and emptier than it had been for millions of years. Compared to that coming disaster, the collapse of the Carboniferous rainforests appears almost like an early warning. The ancient forests had vanished gradually, reshaped by climate shifts and geological changes. But the Permian extinction would unfold on a scale far more devastating, erasing entire branches of life across the globe. Yet even the Great Dying did not come without warning. Long before the extinction reached its peak, the planet had already begun showing signs of instability. Climate systems fluctuated, volcanic activity intensified, and ecosystems faced pressures they had never experienced before. The forests of the Carboniferous world had disappeared long ago, but the forces that transformed them were still active, still shaping the planet in ways that life could not fully control. And as the Permian era drew toward its end, the Earth itself was preparing for one of the most dramatic turning points in the entire history of life. When scientists study the deep history of life on Earth, certain moments stand out as turning points. The collapse of the Carboniferous rainforests is one of them. More than 300 million years ago, those forests covered enormous stretches of the equatorial world. Their towering vegetation formed wetlands so vast that they reshaped the chemistry of the planet itself. Through the slow work of photosynthesis, they drew carbon dioxide from the air and released oxygen in extraordinary amounts. For tens of millions of years, this green world appeared stable. The forests spread across continents, their roots anchored in saturated soils. Amphibians thrived in the endless wetlands. Insects filled the warm, oxygen-rich air. The entire ecosystem seemed so complete that it must have felt permanent to the creatures living within it. Yet permanence is rarely real in the long story of the Earth. The same forces that allowed the forests to flourish were also part of a larger system that could eventually undo them. Climate patterns, atmospheric chemistry, and geological movements are never isolated from one another. Each influences the others in ways that unfold slowly across deep time. When rainfall patterns shifted and the continents of the world began assembling into the supercontinent Pangaea, the conditions that supported the rainforests gradually disappeared. Swamps dried, habitats fragmented, entire plant communities vanished from regions where they had once dominated for millions of years. What makes this transformation so important is not only the disappearance of the forests themselves, but the insight it provides into how the Earth operates as a connected system. Climate affects vegetation. Vegetation alters the atmosphere, and the atmosphere reshapes climate once again. During the Carboniferous period, the forests played a major role in removing carbon dioxide from the air and storing it underground in the vast deposits that would later become coal. This process helped cool the planet and influenced rainfall patterns across the globe. When those climatic shifts intensified, the very ecosystems responsible for altering the atmosphere began to collapse. It was one of the earliest large-scale examples of ecological feedback recorded in the fossil record. The rainforests had not simply vanished because of a single disaster. Instead, they disappeared through a chain reaction of planetary processes interacting with one another. The Earth had changed, and life had to change with it. Events like this remind scientists that ecosystems, no matter how powerful they appear, exist within a delicate balance, shaped by forces far beyond the reach of any individual species. The Carboniferous rainforests once ruled the equatorial world, but when the planet itself began shifting, when climates changed and continents rearranged, the forests could no longer hold their place. They faded from the landscape, leaving behind coal deposits, fossilized roots, and a story written in layers of stone. Yet the disappearance of the forests did not erase their influence. Long after the last swamp dried and the last giant lycopod tree fell, the legacy of those ecosystems continued shaping the future of life on Earth. And in many ways, that legacy was only beginning to unfold. The collapse of the Carboniferous rainforests did more than transform landscapes. It redirected the future of life on land. Before that transformation, the ecosystems of Earth were shaped largely by wetlands. Amphibians dominated these environments because their bodies were built for constant moisture. Their eggs required water. Their skin depended on humid air. For millions of years, the endless swamps of the Carboniferous world provided exactly the conditions they needed. But when those wetlands began breaking apart, the rules of survival changed. As rainfall patterns shifted and forests fragmented, large areas of land became unsuitable for animals tied closely to water. The world was no longer a continuous network of swamps. Instead, it became a mosaic of habitats, some wet, others dry, many changing with the seasons. In that new environment, different adaptations suddenly became powerful advantages. Reptiles possessed those advantages. Their skin helped prevent dehydration, allowing them to travel across dry ground. Their eggs could develop away from water, protected inside shells and membranes that preserved moisture. These traits opened vast regions of land that amphibians could rarely inhabit. Once those regions became accessible, reptiles began spreading across them. Small populations expanded into new territories. Over generations they adapted to a wide range of environments, forests, plains, river valleys, and increasingly dry landscapes across the growing supercontinent. At the same time, plants were undergoing a transformation of their own. The decline of swamp ecosystems weakened the dominance of spore, producing plants that relied heavily on constant moisture. In their place, seed plants began expanding rapidly. Their seeds allowed them to survive dry periods and disperse across landscapes where spores would have failed. Together, these changes reshaped the structure of ecosystems. New vegetation supported new herbivores. Those herbivores attracted predators. Food webs became more complex as animals and plants adapted to the changing climate. From the perspective of evolution, the collapse of the ancient rainforests was not simply an ending, it was a turning point. The fragmentation of ecosystems forced species to adapt, diversify, and explore ecological niches that had previously remained closed. The rise of reptiles during this time marked the beginning of an evolutionary path that would continue unfolding for hundreds of millions of years. Among the many reptilian groups that appeared during and after this transition were lineages that would eventually give rise to some of the most famous animals in Earth's history. Millions of years later, their descendants would dominate the planet during the age of dinosaurs. In that sense, the disappearance of the Carboniferous rainforests helped prepare the stage for one of the greatest evolutionary eras the world would ever witness. The fall of one ecosystem often prepares the rise of another. Nature rarely leaves empty space unfilled. When environments transform, life responds by evolving in new directions. The ancient forests had vanished, but the evolutionary possibilities created by their collapse continued shaping life across deep time. Yet, the legacy of those forests is not only visible in the creatures that followed them, it is also preserved physically within the Earth itself. Hidden in the rocks and sediments that still record the existence of those long-vanished ecosystems, the story of the Carboniferous rainforests might have vanished forever, if not for one quiet historian. The Earth itself. Long after the forests disappeared, their memory remained locked inside layers of rock spread across continents. These layers formed slowly as sediments accumulated in ancient riverbeds, coastal plains, and the quiet basins where swamps once stood. Each layer preserved fragments of the past. To a casual observer, these rocks might appear ordinary, just bands of stone exposed along cliffs or buried deep beneath the ground. But to scientists who study the deep history of the planet, they are pages of an ancient archive. Within them lies the record of a world that no longer exists. Coal seams reveal where the great wetlands once flourished. These dark layers are the compressed remains of forests that grew and died in oxygen, poor swamps hundreds of millions of years ago. Their presence marks times when the landscape was dominated by waterlogged ecosystems filled with towering vegetation. Between those coal seams lie different types of sediment. Sandstones and mudstones show where rivers once shifted across floodplains. Layers containing minerals formed in drier soils reveal periods when the swamps retreated and the land began to dry. By examining these patterns, scientists can reconstruct the rhythm of ancient climates. They can see when wetlands expanded and when they shrank. They can trace the movement of rivers across landscapes that have long since disappeared. Even the chemistry of the rocks reveals clues about the atmosphere and environment of distant ages. Fossils provide another set of clues. Fragments of ancient plants preserved in stone reveal which species dominated different regions. Spores trapped within sediments show how vegetation changed over time. Fossilized roots still embedded in ancient soils mark the positions where forests once stood. By combining these pieces of evidence, researchers have gradually assembled one of the most detailed pictures of an ancient ecological transformation ever discovered. The collapse of the Carboniferous rainforests did not leave behind written accounts or monuments. Instead, its story survived in scattered traces buried beneath the ground. A fossil leaf here, a layer of coal there, a band of dry soil preserved between sediments. Individually, these clues might seem insignificant, but when studied together, they reveal the slow unraveling of a once dominant ecosystem. Scientists compare rock layers from different parts of the world, aligning them like pieces of a vast geological puzzle. As the pieces come together, the timeline of events becomes clearer. Wetlands once stretched across the equator. Rainfall patterns changed. Forests fragmented. Entire ecosystems disappeared. The rocks remember what the living world could not. They preserve the evidence of transformations that occurred long before humans ever walked the earth. Through careful study of these silent records, scientists can watch the rise and fall of ecosystems across spans of time almost impossible to imagine. The story of the lost forests is written not in books but in stone, and the deeper scientists read those ancient pages, the more clearly they understand a truth that reaches far beyond the Carboniferous world. The balance of Earth's ecosystems has always been fragile, shaped by forces that operate on a planetary scale. When we look back across the immense timeline of Earth's history, the rise and fall of the Carboniferous rainforests carries a quiet message. For tens of millions of years, those forests dominated the planet. They stretched across the equator in vast belts of swamp and vegetation, shaping the atmosphere and influencing the climate of the world. Their towering plants filled the air with oxygen. Their roots anchored ecosystems that seemed powerful and permanent. Yet nothing on Earth is truly permanent. The forests that once covered enormous portions of the planet exist today only as fragments preserved in stone. Their trunks have vanished. Their leaves have crumbled into sediment. Their wetlands have long since dried and transformed into entirely different landscapes. What remains are traces, coal seams buried deep underground, fossilized roots preserved in ancient soils, fragments of leaves and spores captured within layers of rock. These remnants remind us that even the most dominant ecosystems can fade when the conditions that sustain them begin to change. The Carboniferous forests flourished because the planet provided exactly the climate they required. Warm temperatures, abundant rainfall, and stable wetlands allowed their strange vegetation to spread across continents. But when rainfall patterns shifted and the continents slowly rearranged themselves, the balance that sustained those ecosystems began to unravel. Swamps dried. Habitats fragmented. Entire plant communities disappeared. Life did not end, of course. Evolution continued shaping new forms, new ecosystems, and new possibilities. Reptiles expanded across the land. Seed plants replaced the ancient swamp vegetation. The world moved forward into another chapter of its long and complex history. Yet the forests themselves were gone. Their disappearance reminds us that life and climate are deeply intertwined. Changes in one inevitably affect the other. Vegetation alters the atmosphere. The atmosphere shapes the climate. Climate determines which ecosystems can survive. These connections operate slowly, often across spans of time far longer than human experience. But they are always at work. The ancient rainforests of the Carboniferous period seemed eternal to the creatures that lived within them. Generation after generation was born beneath their canopies without ever witnessing the conditions that had allowed those forests to exist in the first place. When the planet changed, those ecosystems could not remain the same. Today, their memory lies hidden beneath modern landscapes. Cities stand above the coal that once formed ancient swamp floors. Mountains rise from rocks that once held the roots of towering lycopod trees. Beneath our feet lies the fossilized record of a world that shaped the atmosphere we breathe today. The forests themselves are gone, but the lessons they left behind continue shaping how scientists understand the planet. They remind us that Earth's ecosystems are not fixed or permanent. They evolve alongside the climate, the continents, and the countless forms of life that inhabit the world. The ancient forests vanished long ago, yet their story remains one of the most important chapters in the history of life. A quiet reminder that the planet is always changing, even when those changes unfold slowly across the deep currents of time. When the collapse of the Carboniferous rainforests is placed within the immense timeline of Earth's history, it begins to look less like a rare catastrophe and more like part of a recurring pattern. The story of life on this planet is filled with moments when ecosystems flourish for astonishing lengths of time. Forests spread across continents. Oceans teem with complex communities, and species evolve intricate relationships with the environments that sustain them. For millions of years, these systems appear stable, balanced, and resilient. To the creatures living within them, such worlds must feel permanent. Generation after generation experiences the same landscapes, the same climate, the same cycles of life. Over time, those conditions come to feel like the natural order of the planet itself. But the geological record reveals a different reality. Earth is not a still world. Beneath its surface, tectonic plates move slowly but relentlessly, carrying continents across the globe. Mountains rise where landmasses collide. Oceans open and close as the crust of the planet shifts. Above the surface, the atmosphere changes as volcanic eruptions release gases and ecosystems alter the chemistry of the air. Even the orbit of the Earth around the Sun changes subtly over immense spans of time, influencing the distribution of sunlight and the rhythms of climate. These forces operate quietly, often too slowly to be noticed within a single lifetime. Yet across millions of years, their effects accumulate. Rainfall patterns change, temperatures rise or fall, sea levels expand and retreat. Winds shift their paths across the continents. When these environmental changes cross certain thresholds, ecosystems that once seemed stable begin to falter. Habitats shrink, species struggle to adapt, and eventually entire biological systems begin to unravel. The Carboniferous rainforests represent one of the earliest large ecosystems to experience this process on a global scale. For tens of millions of years, they dominated the equatorial regions of the planet, shaping the atmosphere and supporting complex webs of life. Yet when the climate shifted and the continents reorganized themselves into Pangaea, the conditions that sustained those forests disappeared. What followed was not merely the loss of a single ecosystem. It was a transformation that redirected the course of life on land. Events like this remind scientists that stability in nature is often temporary. Ecosystems may endure for extraordinary lengths of time, but they exist within a planetary system that is always evolving. The forests that once covered the Carboniferous world seemed eternal to the animals and plants that depended on them. But the Earth itself has never allowed any environment to remain unchanged forever. Across billions of years, similar transformations have reshaped oceans, continents, and the living world again and again. The collapse of the ancient rainforests was only one chapter in this ongoing story. And when we begin to look deeper into the geological record, a fascinating question emerges. If the rainforest collapse was part of a larger planetary pattern, how often has the Earth experienced transformations just as profound? When scientists examine the deep fossil record, they begin to notice something remarkable. The history of life on Earth does not unfold as a steady, uninterrupted story. Instead, it moves through cycles, periods of stability followed by moments of dramatic transformation. Entire ecosystems flourish for millions of years, reaching extraordinary levels of diversity and complexity. Then, slowly or suddenly, the conditions that sustain those ecosystems begin to change. The balance shifts, and a new world emerges. One of the earliest examples of this pattern appeared in the ancient oceans during the Cambrian period, more than 500 million years ago. In a relatively short span of geological time, the seas filled with complex life forms, unlike anything that had existed before. Strange creatures with shells, limbs, and eyes suddenly appeared, transforming marine ecosystems across the planet. For a time, those communities dominated the oceans. But as the planet continued changing, many of those early forms vanished, replaced by new groups better suited to evolving conditions. Millions of years later, another turning point reshaped the living world. At the end of the Permian period, environmental upheavals triggered the largest mass extinction in Earth's history. Nearly 90% of marine species disappeared, along with countless animals on land. The planet's ecosystems collapsed. Yet from that devastation emerged entirely new forms of life. Reptiles diversified, and later ages would see the rise of the dinosaurs, creatures that ruled the Earth for more than 160 million years. Even their reign would not last forever. At the end of the Cretaceous period, an asteroid impact altered the climate so dramatically that the age of dinosaurs came to an abrupt close. In the quiet aftermath of that event, mammals began expanding into ecological roles that had once belonged to giant reptiles. Another transformation had begun. When these events are viewed together, a pattern becomes clear. A dominant ecosystem spreads across the planet, Life adapts to the conditions of that world and flourishes within it. Over immense spans of time, the environment appears stable, but deep planetary forces are always at work. Climate shifts, continents drift, volcanic eruptions alter the chemistry of the atmosphere. Oceans change their currents. Eventually, the conditions that sustained the existing ecosystems begin to fade. Life responds by evolving, diversifying, and exploring new possibilities. The collapse of the Carboniferous rainforests fits naturally into this sequence. It was not the largest extinction event, nor the most dramatic transformation recorded in the fossil record, yet it represents one of the earliest examples of climate reshaping life across the land. The ancient forests flourished under specific conditions. When those conditions changed, the ecosystems that depended on them could not remain the same. From their disappearance came new landscapes, new plants, and new animals that would shape the future of life. In many ways, the rainforest collapse served as a rehearsal for later transformations that would occur again and again throughout Earth's history. The fall of the ancient forests was not an isolated tragedy. It was part of a cycle that has reshaped the living world for hundreds of millions of years. And the deeper we look into this cycle, the more intriguing the pattern becomes, because it reveals something profound about the relationship between life and the planet itself. For much of history, it was easy to imagine life as something that simply adapts to the world around it. Plants grow where the climate allows. Animals survive within the boundaries set by temperature, rainfall, and geography. The planet provides the stage, and life responds to its conditions. Yet the deeper scientists study Earth's past, the clearer another truth becomes. Life does not merely live on the planet, it reshapes the planet itself. The ancient rainforests of the Carboniferous period offer one of the most powerful examples of this phenomenon. These forests were not just collections of plants growing across wetlands. They were enormous biological systems interacting with the atmosphere, the soil, and the climate of the entire world. Through the quiet process of photosynthesis, the forests absorbed vast quantities of carbon dioxide from the air. Every leaf that captured sunlight helped convert that carbon into plant tissue. When those plants died and fell into oxygen-poor swamps, much of that carbon became buried underground, instead of returning to the atmosphere. Over millions of years, this process removed extraordinary amounts of carbon dioxide from the sky. At the same time, oxygen levels rose. The atmosphere that surrounded the Carboniferous world slowly transformed as forests spread across the equatorial regions. The planet cooled as greenhouse gases declined. Glaciers began forming in the southern hemisphere, reshaping sea levels and altering climate patterns across the globe. In an unexpected twist, the very ecosystems responsible for transforming the atmosphere may have helped create the environmental changes that eventually destabilized them. As carbon dioxide levels dropped and climates cooled, rainfall patterns began shifting. The delicate balance of constant humidity that supported the endless swamps slowly began to break down. The forests had not simply been victims of planetary change. They had helped drive that change themselves. Scientists refer to this process as ecological feedback. It occurs when living organisms influence environmental conditions in ways that later affect the organisms themselves. These feedback loops appear repeatedly throughout Earth's long history. Billions of years ago, microscopic organisms in the oceans began releasing oxygen into the atmosphere through photosynthesis. Over time, their activity transformed the chemistry of the air, eventually creating the oxygen-rich world that complex life depends upon today. Coral reefs alter the chemistry of seawater and influence ocean ecosystems across entire regions. Forests today continue affecting climate by absorbing carbon, releasing moisture, and shaping patterns of rainfall. The relationship between life and the planet is not one-sided. The environment shapes living systems, and living systems reshape the environment. The Carboniferous rainforests demonstrate this relationship on a grand scale. Their expansion altered the atmosphere. The altered atmosphere influenced climate. That climate change eventually helped bring about the decline of the forests themselves. Life had changed the planet, and the planet responded. Understanding this relationship transforms the story of the ancient rainforests from a simple tale of ecological collapse into something deeper. It reveals a world where living organisms and planetary systems are constantly interacting, shaping one another across immense spans of time. And once we recognize this pattern, the disappearance of those forests begins to feel less like a distant historical curiosity. It begins to feel like a lesson written into the very history of the Earth. When the story of the Carboniferous rainforests is viewed across the immense sweep of geological time, it begins to reveal something both humbling and profound. Those forests once dominated the planet. For tens of millions of years they spread across equatorial regions with a power that must have seemed unstoppable. Their towering vegetation shaped the atmosphere, influenced global climate, and supported complex ecosystems filled with amphibians, insects, and countless other forms of life. The world beneath their canopies appeared stable. Generation after generation of creatures lived and died without witnessing any sign that the forests surrounding them might one day disappear. The swamps remained wet, the vegetation remained dense, and the rhythm of life continued much as it always had. To the living world of that time, the forests must have felt eternal, but the deeper record of the Earth tells a different story. Over millions of years, subtle changes began reshaping the conditions that had allowed those ecosystems to thrive. Continents moved slowly toward one another, assembling into the supercontinent Pangaea. Mountain ranges rose along the collision zones, altering the pathways of wind and rainfall across the globe. At the same time, the atmosphere itself was changing. The forests had removed enormous amounts of carbon dioxide from the air, helping cool the planet and contributing to the spread of glaciers in the southern hemisphere. These climatic shifts gradually disrupted the steady rainfall patterns that had sustained the ancient wetlands. None of these changes happened suddenly. There was no single catastrophic moment when the forests vanished overnight. Instead, the transformation unfolded quietly across immense spans of time. Rainfall patterns shifted, wetlands began to dry, swamps fragmented into isolated patches. Plant communities that had dominated the landscape for millions of years slowly disappeared from region after region. Animals that depended on those habitats either adapted to new conditions or vanished alongside them. The collapse of the Carboniferous rainforests was not a single disaster. It was a chain reaction. Each environmental change triggered another until the ecosystem that once covered vast portions of the planet could no longer sustain itself. What makes this story so compelling is the lesson it reveals about the nature of life on Earth. Even the most powerful ecosystems exist within boundaries defined by the planet itself. Climate patterns, atmospheric chemistry, and geological forces set limits that no forest, ocean, or species can escape. When those limits shift, life must respond. Some organisms adapt, others evolve into entirely new forms, and many disappear, leaving only fossils behind. The ancient forests ruled the planet for millions of years. Yet when the planet quietly changed the rules, even those immense ecosystems could not remain the same. Today, their remains lie buried beneath modern landscapes, preserved in coal seams and fossilized roots. Their story survives as a reminder that the living world is always part of a larger system, one shaped by forces far older and more powerful than any single ecosystem. And when we look at that story from the present day, it raises an intriguing question. What might the lessons of those ancient forests reveal about the world we live in now? Although the great Carboniferous rainforests vanished hundreds of millions of years ago, their presence has never truly disappeared. In many ways, we still walk above their remains, beneath modern landscapes. Below cities, mountains, farmland, and forests lie enormous layers of coal formed from the compressed vegetation of those ancient wetlands. These dark seams stretch across continents, hidden within the earth like the preserved memory of a vanished world. To most people, coal is simply a resource, a black rock extracted from deep mines and burned to produce energy. But every piece of coal carries a story far older than human history. Within those layers are the fossilized remains of plants that once grew in the swamps of the Carboniferous period. Leaves, spores, fragments of bark, and even entire root systems have been preserved within the rock, trapped in place when ancient forests collapsed into the mud of oxygen, poor wetlands. Over millions of years, pressure and heat slowly transformed those buried plant remains into the coal deposits that still lie beneath our feet today. These deposits are more than fuel. They are time capsules. Scientists studying coal seams often discover delicate fossils preserved within the rock, tiny spores that reveal which plants once filled the swamps, fragments of wood that show the structure of long-extinct trees, and patterns of ancient soil that record where forests once stood. By analyzing these clues, researchers have been able to reconstruct the ecosystems of a world that vanished hundreds of millions of years ago. They can determine when wetlands expanded across the land and when they retreated. They can identify the types of vegetation that dominated particular regions. Even the chemistry of the coal itself provides hints about the atmosphere and climate that existed during the age of the rainforests. Through these records, the ancient forests continue to speak. Every coal seam marks a place where a prehistoric swamp once thrived. Every fossilized leaf represents sunlight captured by plants long before the first mammals appeared on Earth. The landscapes that surround us today, modern forests, plains and mountains, are layered above the remnants of those ancient ecosystems. Their influence remains embedded within the planet's geological memory. It is a quiet presence invisible to most people, yet deeply woven into the structure of the Earth itself. When miners dig into coal-bearing rock, they are not just uncovering energy sources. They are opening windows into a distant past where enormous forests dominated the equator and the air carried more oxygen than it does today. Those forests may be gone, but their shadows remain. They lie beneath the ground we walk on, preserved in stone, as fragments of a world that once shaped the atmosphere, the climate, and the course of life on this planet. And the deeper scientists explore these ancient layers, the more clearly they understand that the story of those forests is not only about the past. It also offers insight into how ecosystems respond when the environment around them begins to change. The story of the Carboniferous rainforests reveals something fundamental about the living world. Ecosystems do not exist in isolation. They depend on a delicate balance of conditions that allow plants, animals, and climates to interact in stable ways. When those conditions remain steady, ecosystems can flourish for immense spans of time. Forests spread, species diversify, and complex relationships develop between organisms and the environments they inhabit. For millions of years, the ancient rainforests of the Carboniferous period thrived under exactly such conditions. Warm temperatures dominated the equatorial regions of the planet. Rainfall arrived frequently enough to keep vast wetlands saturated year-round. Rivers meandered slowly through swamps where enormous plants grew in dense, humid forests. These conditions allowed the ecosystem to expand across enormous areas of land. Plants adapted perfectly to the waterlogged soil. Amphibians flourished in the endless wetlands. Insects filled the oxygen-rich air above the canopy. Everything seemed balanced, but the stability of that world depended on factors that were constantly shifting beneath the surface. As continents moved and climates gradually cooled, rainfall patterns began changing across the equatorial regions. Some wetlands received less water than before. Others began experiencing seasonal drying where constant humidity had once prevailed. At first, these shifts appeared minor, yet ecosystems built around highly specific conditions often struggle when those conditions begin to change. Plants adapted to permanent swamps could not easily survive in soils that dried between storms. Animals dependent on wetlands found their habitats shrinking or fragmenting into isolated pockets. Over time, the balance that sustained the forests began to unravel. What followed was not a single moment of collapse, but a slow transformation. Forests receded. Species adapted or vanished. Entire landscapes reorganized themselves as the environment continued shifting. The lesson hidden within this ancient story remains relevant across the entire history of life. Every ecosystem on Earth depends on a similar balance between climate, water, and living organisms. Modern rainforests rely on steady rainfall and warm temperatures to sustain their dense vegetation. Coral reefs depend on stable ocean chemistry and narrow temperature ranges. Wetlands require consistent water levels to support the plants and animals that inhabit them. When these conditions remain stable, ecosystems can endure for thousands or even millions of years. But when the balance shifts, the living world must respond. Throughout Earth's history, such transformations have occurred again and again. Ice ages have reshaped continents. Ocean currents have altered marine ecosystems. Volcanic eruptions have changed the chemistry of the atmosphere. Each time the environment changes, life adapts, evolves, or disappears. The collapse of the Carboniferous rainforests stands as one of the earliest examples of this process unfolding on land. It reminds us that even the most powerful ecosystems depend on environmental conditions that can change over time. Life on Earth has never existed in a fixed world. It exists within a planet that is constantly evolving. Understanding events like the rainforest collapse helps scientists see how ecosystems respond when the conditions supporting them begin to shift. These ancient transformations provide clues about the resilience of life and the limits of that resilience. Yet, when we step back even further, the story of the ancient rainforests reveals something deeper still. It shows how the entire living world is woven into the long, unfolding history of the planet itself. The collapse of the Carboniferous rainforests might sound like the end of a world. In many ways it was. For tens of millions of years, those forests had dominated the equatorial regions of the planet. Their wetlands supported immense plant communities and complex ecosystems filled with amphibians, insects, and early land animals. When the climate shifted and the swamps began to disappear, the environment that had sustained that living world slowly unraveled. Entire plant communities vanished from regions where they had once thrived. Animals tied closely to the wetlands struggled to survive as their habitats shrank and fragmented. From the perspective of those ecosystems, it was a collapse. Yet the story of life did not end there. Life rarely ends with a single ecosystem. Instead, it adapts. As the ancient forests receded, new plant communities began spreading across the land. Seed plants, capable of surviving drier conditions, expanded into landscapes where swamp vegetation could no longer grow. Early conifers and seed ferns formed forests adapted to seasonal climates, rather than permanent wetlands. These plants created entirely new environments. Animals responded in turn. Reptiles, already equipped with adaptations for life away from water, expanded across the changing landscapes. Their protective skin and land-based eggs allowed them to thrive in regions that amphibians could rarely inhabit. Over time, reptiles diversified into new ecological roles: predators, herbivores, and scavengers, occupying niches that had not existed in the earlier swamp ecosystems. The living world reorganized itself. Where one set of ecosystems vanished, another began to take shape. This quiet resilience appears again and again throughout Earth's long history. The fossil record shows countless examples of life-enduring events that might seem catastrophic from a human perspective. Ice ages have covered continents in glaciers. Volcanic eruptions have filled the atmosphere with ash and gases. Asteroid impacts have altered the climate of the entire planet. Each of these events reshaped the living world in dramatic ways. Species disappeared. Habitats transformed. Entire ecosystems collapsed. And yet life persisted. After every upheaval, new species emerged. Evolution explored fresh possibilities, filling the spaces left behind by earlier forms of life. Over immense spans of time, ecosystems rebuilt themselves in ways that often looked very different from those that came before. The Carboniferous rainforests were one chapter in this ongoing story. Their disappearance did not bring the experiment of life to an end. Instead, it opened pathways for new plants, new animals, and new ecological relationships that would shape the future of the planet. The landscapes that replaced the ancient swamps eventually supported reptilian empires and, millions of years later, the ancestors of creatures that would dominate the Earth during the age of dinosaurs. Life has endured ice ages, asteroid impacts, and collapsing ecosystems. Through every transformation, it has continued adapting, evolving, and exploring new possibilities. The forests that once covered the Carboniferous world were only one expression of life's creativity. When they vanished, the broader story of life simply turned the page and continued forward across the immense and ever-changing history of the Earth. Hundreds of millions of years ago, the Earth was a very different place. Long before the rise of dinosaurs, before the first mammals moved quietly through ancient forests, before human beings ever imagined the deep history of the planet, another world existed across the equator. It was a world of forests, Vast wetlands stretched across continents beneath warm skies heavy with humidity. Rivers drifted slowly through endless swamps, where enormous plants rose from dark, waterlogged soil. The air itself carried more oxygen than it does today, filling the atmosphere with a richness that allowed life to grow in extraordinary ways. Within those forests lived creatures unlike anything alive in the modern world. Giant dragonflies glided through the humid air, their wings catching sunlight above the canopy. Enormous millipedes moved slowly across the forest floor, their many segments sliding through thick layers of fallen leaves. Amphibians, some small and agile, others massive and heavy-bodied, wandered through shallow waters that stretched across the landscape. Above them all rose the plants. Towering lycopod trees climbed toward the sky, their trunks reaching heights comparable to modern buildings. Giant horseales and ferns formed dense walls of vegetation along the edges of rivers and swamps. The ground beneath these forests was tangled with roots, branches, and decaying plant matter slowly sinking into the mud. To the creatures living there, this world must have seemed eternal. The wetlands remained wet, the forests remained green. Generation after generation was born beneath those towering plants, without ever witnessing the forces that had created the environment around them. For millions of years, the forests ruled the planet. They shaped the atmosphere, drawing carbon dioxide from the air and releasing oxygen in immense quantities. They spread across continents, forming ecosystems so vast that their influence reached far beyond the boundaries of the swamps themselves. Yet even worlds that appear timeless eventually change. The continents began drifting together, assembling into the massive supercontinent Pangaea. Mountain ranges rose where land masses collided, altering the flow of winds and rainfall across the globe. The climate slowly shifted, and the endless humidity that sustained the wetlands began to fade. At first, the changes were subtle, but over immense spans of time, the swamps dried, the forests fragmented, and the ecosystem that had once dominated the equatorial world quietly disappeared. Today, those forests survive only as fragments preserved in stone. Coal seams buried deep beneath the earth hold the compressed remains of ancient vegetation. Fossilized leaves and spores reveal the plants that once covered the land. Roots preserved in ancient soils mark the places where towering trees once stood. Their memory lies hidden beneath modern landscapes. The forests themselves are gone, but their story remains written in the deep history of our planet. It reminds us that the Earth has always been a world of transformation. Ecosystems rise, flourish, and eventually fade as the planet changes around them. Long before humans walked the Earth, another world of forests rose, thrived beneath ancient skies, and quietly disappeared into the layers of time. Somewhere within those layers, countless other forgotten worlds still wait to be discovered.